The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendrix, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. John Hendrix is a much-decorated illustrator and author and a professor of art at Washington University in St. Louis. His most recent book, The Faithful Spy, is a graphic novel telling the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the plot to kill Adolf Hitler. I don't think of myself as a fan of graphic novels, but I love this book. It won a gold medal from the Society of Illustrators. John Hendrix, I am so happy that you are on the Habit Podcast. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about visual art and writing and how those things work together, play off one another, that sort of thing.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
You know, it's kind of I would say it's an unspoken policy, but I'm about to speak it, that this podcast isn't like for promotion of books or projects, but rather we're just going to talk about writing. But I've got to make an exception because I am crazy about your most recent book, The Faithful Spy. I think it is so good, and I hope 1 million people read it. I think it's an important book. And I really love this book that tells the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his the choices he made. So thank you for making that book.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad that it connected with you. And of course, anytime we make stuff, there's the love of making it, of course, and that's probably what we would tell people when they ask why you do things. But ultimately, you actually want someone to read it and connect to it. It always means a lot. I always tell people that you should always tell authors when something they did connected with you, because that's really deep down that's what they want. More than just sort of general praise.
Right.
They're like, oh, you're really good. What we really want is oh, that made me see something in myself or others of the world that was totally different, and that connection is really what we're writing for, I think.
Yeah. I don't think of myself as being a graphic novel person, and but that one really grabbed me. And so many of my favorite, books or movies or whatever are the kind of thing that I think of as not being my kind of thing. And then when it pushes through, when something in that genre pushes through to me, it becomes one of my favorite things. That's the way I feel about. It's not that I dislike graphic novels. I just don't think about them much one way or another. It's just not what I typically read. And the fact that one pushed through my prejudices and really captured me. It's just one of the things I love about it. So thank you for doing it. What made you? Why did you choose to write and draw about Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Well,
to me, the story I loved Dietrich's writing. That's where I first came to it. I read his works in college. I didn't get into the meaty stuff. I read, Life Together and Cost of Discipleship. I mean, actually, those are very meaty, but the sort of theologically, the dense works I did not get into. And I knew his story tangentially. And a few years ago, I saw the movie Valkyrie when it came out, which was that Tom Cruise movie about the Stauffenberg plot. And I assumed that most of the movie was sort of fictitious or exaggerated. And as I looked into it, I saw it was like actually extremely accurate and totally compelling. And it reminded me of the Bonhoeffer story. And I was like, this really needs to be made, not for like a big world purpose, but just like I was interested in his story. It intersected with some of the themes that I encountered in some of my other work. And this was like 2000, I don't know when I started thinking about it, but it was probably 5 years ago at least. And I mean, the great thing about my work at the time is I had already started exploring some of these themes in picture books, which is pretty challenging as a format to try to explore some of these morality, ethics questions. And in many ways, I knew I couldn't do Bonhoeffer in that format. It was just too small. And so that's when I started to explore the idea with my agent, actually. She was the one who said, well, just write for middle grade, like write a long, a novel. And I was like, wait, I can't do that. I'm an illustrator. I'm not qualified. And she's like, of course you can do that. So, that's how it started. And we started pitching sort of this quasi-novel, quasi-graphic novel mashup. And Abrams was keen to take it.
Do you know how your agent knew that you could do that?
Well, I think I asked her about that. She was like, well, you had written good stuff before. She said some version of just write more of it,
Yeah.
Which that does seem rather simple, I guess. But I think she also knew that I had a real vision for what the book would feel like, and that the idea that, quote, I'm not a writer is not something that should, hold you back. And I've never, trained as a writer. I mean, I spent so much time training as an artist and author, like training as an author or something, but not a writer. And so I was intimidated by the actual craft. But of course, I had a wonderful editor who I've worked with for many years. He's edited all my authored works, and so I really trusted him. And it wouldn't be, as almost any author says, some version of this, but like it would not be the book it is without my editor and my copy editor. And so I'm very grateful to their help. And anytime you go through the first pass where they catch these grammatical errors that are just like egregious. It's very embarrassing, and so I'm thankful.
So, I guess you had to get it clean before you ever did the lettering, right? I mean, is that how that works? You.
Oh man, I wish I had gotten it clean. The thing is, I had originally imagined hand lettering the whole thing because I wanted to feel like a sketchbook. That just proved impossible. I did one page hand lettered. It was almost a whole day of lettering because by the time I cleaned it up and everything, I'm like, I cannot do 200 pages like this. So I hired a typographer to build a typeface out of my handwriting, and it has a bunch of alternate what are called glyphs. So like each A has 4 A's in it.
Gotcha.
And they swap out randomly, so it looks more hand drawn. So fortunately, the text corrections were pretty easy to do, with the exception of sort of splashy display type.
Okay, I didn't. You fooled me. I thought that was hand lettered.
Oh, good. That was the whole point. So I'm glad.
Well, good. All right. So moving on, I want to talk about so since you have written a book that is as much, it's equal parts visual and written. Talk to me about the relationship between visual art and writing? What is your experience as a visual artist? How has that shaped your writing? And we'll start there. And if the floor is open.
Well, people always ask what came first, the pictures or the words, and it's kind of the same with like you ask a songwriter. It's kind of like, well, it's kind of both and,
Mm-hmm.
or in this case, I really had to get a pretty clean manuscript before I could drop it into the pages, because obviously each page is so customized in terms of its design that I can't just flow more text onto the next page if I write too long.
Right.
So it was really organic early on. I did little thumbnails, and there were certain images that I had from almost the first moment I thought of the project. I'm like, there has to be this thing in there. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. But from a conceptual point of view, I really don't in my work consider a line between text and image, mostly because my images have so much text in them.
Right.
So I really love the sort of incarnational aspect of the word becoming flesh, the word and image being completely intertwined. Uh-huh. And so I write and create with that idea, that the text is not captions for the pictures.
Right.
Or they don't, then the images don't explain the text necessarily, but they're doing something independent, which then creates this kind of new third space.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, there's something about the way that particular book works. I may be stating the obvious here, but it's like shape poetry,
Right. Yeah.
And I have a soft spot for shape poetry too.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that there's this Annie Dillard book where she did. It really changed my mind about writing or what writing could be. It was called Mornings Like This, and it was all poetry that was found. She just collage, poetry collage. Uh-huh. And, thinking of writing as not creating words, but as a curator, totally changed the way I think about writing, because that's kind of what I do with images and words together. Is I don't think of myself as writing beautiful sentence, as curating a collision of word and image together. And then it's not so intimidating,
Interesting. Yeah. George Orwell in what is that essay? The Politics of the English Language. I don't know if you've read that, but he says, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, it's a mistake as a writer to start with words. A writer, to the extent that you can, you need to start with images and then go find the words that depict those images. And I mean, he wasn't talking about writing graphic novels. He was talking about if you start with the words take over, and these sort of preformed phrases, cliches, whatever, will sort of take over for you and do the thinking for you. And his advice is, to the extent that you can, think in images first and then fit words to those images.
Yeah.
And, that to me seems like great advice. I don't always know how to help other writers implement that advice. I wonder if you have any insights on that from your...
I mean, I totally resonate with that. Partially because, I'm sort of cheating in this, but almost everything starts with imagery or images in some way. Uh-huh. And I always think about that Lewis quote where the Narnia books came out of not some big idea or notion, or I shall write an allegory about Christianity, but that he saw this fawn walking through the snow by a lamppost with a package. And he's like, I got to figure out where that came from.
Yeah.
So I do believe that is completely true. Now, how you cultivate that as a discipline, or as a way to access when you are stuck. I mean, I think I'm a firm believer in sketchbooks, and that doesn't mean just for drawing. I mean, writers can keep sketchbooks, because I just fundamentally believe that our best ideas come from actions and not thinking necessarily. At least in the art world, you don't. I mean, yes, you can come up with a good idea, think it's great, and then execute it with your hand. But usually for me, like the thing that I start drawing with is not the best idea, and that the act of drawing, the act of having my pen in motion on a sheet of paper triggers new ideas and associations that in a way that just thinking in a blank room with beautiful music would not do. Now, that's probably because I'm visual and the kinetic action of my hand drawing is almost like a muscle memory.
Yeah.
But I do think writers can do exercises that are not writing necessarily, but that will help produce imagery in a way that's like low pressure, mistakes are expected, and you're just like in sort of generation. You're like in a generative state rather than a production state.
Tell me about the distinction between generative and production.
Well, like I'd say, you know, when you're sketching in your sketchbook and you're just there for enjoyment of drawing and like, oh, I kind of want to draw a bee right now, and oh, look at that great cloud. You know, you're just generating things. And then maybe, oh man, the bee and the cloud merge and you create a sort of new thing from it, right? And then production is where you're like, I have to get a result at the end of this. Yeah. And when you combine those two things, it's a disaster because you're like, oh no, I need to, at the end of this, I have to have a page of comics and they have to work. Yeah. And so that's a very different activity than I'm trying to create something. So you have to like create and then evaluate in two different places. It's just that, and we conflate editing and creation into the same activity, and it makes people insane because that's not, those are not the same activity.
Yeah. I often talk about producing, and that's your remarks here give me reason to maybe reconsider that language because I like that. I mean, I think that's a helpful distinction you're making, and so duly noted. I'm filing that away.
Well, I bet you could wordsmith it a little bit. Maybe it's less production and more almost like performance. You know, because we can produce things that are brainstormy ideas, but I think there's a pressure that comes with artists, and I'm sure with writers too. That's like, now is when I will perform the act of making good writing. You know, and it's a very weird. It's like a head game you have to play with yourself. At least for me, I have to sort of take the stakes down of what I'm making in certain places so that it doesn't become too precious.
Sometimes I'm not very good at doing lino cuts, but I do lino cuts sometimes, and I find that very helpful. It makes me want to go write something whenever I do a lino cut, and for me, a big part of it is I just like doing something. I know when you're writing, you're doing something with your hands, especially as I write with a pen on paper, so that is doing something with your hands, but I really like every now and then doing something, making something that has a physical artifact, and that feels like an important stimulus for me to go write something.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, if you ask me, I think there is something hard-coded into our mind about making physical things that is so satisfying and unlocks like part of our humanity. Yeah. And I think the digital world has flattened that, where we don't get the same satisfaction of, I always tell, like I have students that I direct them to like, you need to go and fill a page with like tiny circles. Like you need an activity that is slow and methodical and requires patience, because it requires us to slow down to a pace that our brains think at or something. So, and I think that lino cut is like that, where you like, it's this process. You see the results. It's satisfying. It's slow. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my old MFA instructor, Marshall Harrisman, used to call that sort of stuff rain dancing. It's like the thing you do to get the work. It's like, we all have different rain dances that we perform before we make the real art, whether it's like cleaning your studio or like whatever the thing. We probably call it procrastinating, but I actually think it's like key to the process, because whatever it is, it's like slowing our brain down enough that we're ready to enter into the art making or something. Yeah.
Do you do electronic? Are you doing your stuff with computers, or is it always with a?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's kind of a blend. Like, the drawings in Faithful Spy were all made by hand with pencil on paper, but then the color was all digital. I edited them all digitally. So it's a blend process. I end up spending, some time on the drawing table and some time on the computer.
Mm-hmm. So when you are writing a book like The Faithful Spy, I got the feeling from what you were saying earlier, it's all covering the same part of your brain, the words and the images. It's not that you're working two parts of your brain is the way you think about it. Is that fair to say? It's all the same part of your brain?
Yeah, I feel like it's an extension of how I think about things. So yeah, it did not feel like two different languages.
Yeah. I guess this was on your a video on your website where you're taking a couple of minutes to talk about, I don't remember what you're talking about, but you talked about how as a child you just wanted to draw more than anything, or I guess maybe not just as a child, probably still.
Probably still.
Yeah. Like, can you put any language to why? I mean, why is it that you want to draw so bad?
This is such an interesting question, and I ask this with my students all the time because I think it is so revealing. Like, why are we compelled to make this stuff? And a question I often have them think about is, if there's no right answer to this, but it tells you something about yourself. If you were on a desert island alone with all of your art supplies, would you still make art? And what kind of things would you make? And what I think that is helpful to think about is how much of art making is for yourself and for the enjoyment, and how much of it is for communicating to the world and to other people. And for me, taking the component out of it that I'm not allowed to speak to the world with it takes out a huge chunk of what I love about art making. So for me, I mean, I love the act and the physical pleasure of drawing and making lines and satisfying shapes and colors, but what I like even more is saying something to people. So to remove that is a big change in what I would think about why I make things. So I've always had a love of just the sort of wall of stillness you can put around yourself when you're drawing, and that it's kind of always a place you can escape to when you're bored or in a meeting, or, when I was young in church, I could always find a place of imagination and enjoyment kind of within myself, and that was very satisfying. But I did not make those things to go into a vault. I wanted other people to see them, and I wanted it to say something to people. So I think it is both pleasure and enjoyment, and in some cases a kind of worship, but a lot of it is wanting to say something.
Yeah. So if you were on a desert island, what would you make?
Yeah. I think I would probably end up doing things like Andy Goldsworthy. You know his work?
No, I don't know
his
work.
You might, once I describe it, you might recognize it. He is a nature artist, and he goes throughout the woods and he'll arrange leaves into these beautiful geometric, starkly geometric shapes, or he'll build ice sculptures, or he'll take a bunch of twigs and turn them into a house and just leave them in the woods. And they're so haunting and beautiful. I think I would probably turn into some sort of Tom Hanks on Castaway.
Yeah, that's funny. I was just thinking
I'd be talking to a volleyball and building coconut sculptures. I think it would I would want to make beauty. I would want to have the beautiful around me.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure I don't think I would write if I was just writing stories that nobody else would see.
Yeah, you see what I mean? If you think about it, you're like, well, no, I love writing, but then you're like, wait, well, who's it for? Is it just for me, or it's very strange.
Yeah, and so I think I feel like I would make lino cuts because those aren't good enough for me to be showing to people anyway, really, and I just like doing it.
Right? Yeah.
So that's a fascinating question.
Or maybe poems or something.
Poems, you said?
Yeah, maybe poems. Maybe you would want something that would help you try to understand your experience, but not necessarily display it. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I've got a question for you that I don't know who else to ask. When I'm talking to my writing students about concrete sensory language and the importance of writing in concrete terms and not letting things float off into abstraction. One of the things we talk about is the visual sense is kind of low-hanging fruit. You've got to, it's really important that you create a visual sense in your writing. an oral sense also. And then if you can work in into the other three senses, that really makes things pop. If you can include smells or tastes or textures. In other words, if you can get beyond the visual to some of those, you got to have the visual almost always. You can't really function without it very well in writing. If you can include the other senses, great. In the visual arts, do you have the option of reaching beyond the visual to the other four senses?
Oh yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, in illustration, so you're limited to. I mean, the thing that makes illustration is that there's text associated with it. So like you don't. An illustration that's hanging in a gallery without text is actually, in some ways, no longer an illustration. So it's an image. So I think in illustration, you're almost limited to the sensory of the page in some way. But certainly in performance art or art that occupies a physical space, you can start to touch other senses. I mean, in some ways, the comic is very interesting because it allows you to slide time differently. Like you can play, like when you're reading a sentence, you're always reading kind of at the same pace. But in comics, you can take one moment and describe it in 18 panels or two. The physical experience of reading 18 panels actually changes time, not just the narrative, right? So that's one of the cool features of what comics does that like even film or writing can't do specifically. And it's actually one of the reasons why I feel like, I mean, there's probably a whole like graduate thesis underneath this somewhere, but the Marvel movies I find completely flat and uninspiring. I mean, I enjoy them because my son loves them, and I think there's some mythology there that's interesting. But I think they worked like fundamentally in comics in a superior way because of the way panels work and the way that your brain closes the information like gestalt, between the gap between the panels. And I think that allowed the mythology of superheroes to resonate in like a bigger way. There's something about seeing the real Iron Man on the screen that deflates him in some weird way. I've never been able to articulate exactly because most people I tell they're like, whatever, I love it, it's awesome, but I can't explain it, but I do think they were better in the comics.
That's interesting. So no matter how big the spectacle in a Marvel movie, it can't catch up with what your mind can do with the gaps in a comic strip.
Yes, and I think it's one of the reasons why comics work as a medium. They're not like, you couldn't do an animated movie, so you did a comic. It's not like a half stop before you get to something more lush,
Yeah. Okay, so you've hit time and movement. What about smell, texture? Texture. You can definitely do texture.
Yeah, you could do. I mean, there's a lot of books that incorporate, tipped in objects. There was these great books from the '90s called the Griffin and Sabine books. I don't know if you remember these.
I don't.
And they were incredibly expensive to produce, but they ended up being like this sort of cult hit. And they were letters between two lovers, and the books were physically had physical letters stuck into them and slid into envelopes, and there were little artifacts that you found in each one. So it was like a graphic novel almost. There were no pictures; they were just physical, actual letters that you were reading between these two people with tokens in them, and very expensive to produce, but they were so interesting as a reading experience.
Smell, taste, how does a visual artist incorporate those?
Oh, there was I remember an exhibit that had honey in it once. It was a taste and see exhibit. It was riffing on that scripture passage. And it was a sculpture that you were asked to dip your hand into and get the honey and taste it. And then you were supposed to walk around while you were tasting the honey. And of course, that's an art experience that's designed to do that, you know. But in general, I think that's pretty tough to do to activate.
Yeah. Okay, I want to one more thing I want to ask you about that was off of you, that again from kind of poking around on your website that I found interesting, and that is the connection between place and a visual artist's style. As writers, we're very conscious of how place, where you're from shapes the way you write, because idioms and the changes in language from place to place. I'd never given any thought to the fact that would also be true for an artist. And somebody, you said one of your friends commented when she visited St. Louis that some of your lettering, I think, was influenced by St. Louis signage, and you had never thought about that before.
I'd never thought about it. And it's funny, she's Japanese. We shared a studio for several years, and she was in my graduate class together. So we knew each other pretty well and knew our work well. Yeah. But it was so funny. Instantly, she's in St. Louis. She's like, "Oh, I know why you do all this shadow lettering, because there's signage everywhere. Like sort of what you would think of as like Midwest diner signage, and to her, that's not something she had a lot of around where she lived. And so, it was stunning to me that was something that maybe had seeped in that I was not even aware of. So, I think you see it, of course, in landscape,
sure,
and buildings, all the things that you've seen around you influence how you draw and how you think about drawing.
Yeah, that was really interesting. All right. Well, I always end these conversations with the question: what writers make you want to write?
Oh, it's such a good question. There are a lot of writers that I read, and basically, I just want to give up. Like there's a certain kind of writer that I'm like, okay, I cannot do that. Mm-hmm. So I need to find something that feels a little more relatable.
Yeah.
So for me, I think the first thing that came to mind was I already name checked her once in this, but there was Annie Dillard I read in college, and she allowed me to see writing. I read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek on the recommendation of a friend, and it's kind of like a journal. It's kind of like observations.
Yeah.
But it is so beautifully phrased, but it seems very approachable. I know she obviously is an incredibly gifted craftsman with her words, but it has an approachability to it that seems so normal that it allowed me to think like, oh, I can see myself writing this in my journal, and I could be a writer,
Yeah, interesting. And I could imagine an artist loving that book because her attention to detail, paying attention to what she sees. When people go see what Tinker Creek actually is, they're astonished at how unimpressive it is.
Yeah. I've had people tell me that. And actually, I love it even more because of that.
Oh, I know. That's a book that I'm not actually crazy about. It's one of those books that I'm more impressed with than I actually like. I'm impressed that she can do it, but it just doesn't resonate with me the way it does with some people. But I love the fact that it turns out Tinker Creek is the kind of place you would just go right past and never notice, and that she wrote this, incredible stuff about it.
Yeah, as if it's the mighty Atlantic or something. It's just so wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I read that book, and it gave me this whole paradigm for understanding the world as a person of faith too. Uh-huh. And I was so taken by it. In some ways, I don't think I would do this today because I'm not as naive, but I wrote her a letter, just like a fan letter.
Yeah.
And it somehow, I truly think I put Annie Dillard, care of HarperCollins Publishing, and somehow it made it to her, and she wrote me back.
Oh, that's great.
And I still have that. I have that photo, that letter framed in my house at home, because it always reminds me of there's a real person behind this Pulitzer Prize winning, beautiful book.
That's great.
I always think about that.
Wow. Well, John, thank you so much for taking half an hour to talk to me. This has been a lot of fun for me.
Oh, it's great. I'd love taking 30 minutes to talk about big things and good ideas, and such a fan of you and your work. So
thanks.
Keep it up, my friend.
All right. Well, I will say the same to you, and you're doing good work, and I really am thankful for what you're doing. So let's talk soon.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio and the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to the Arcadian Wild for allowing us to use their delightful song Finch in the Pantry as part of this podcast. Check out their album of the same name for more excellent music.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to fostering Christ-centered community and spiritual formation through music, story, and art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.